Yeah, just a quick introduction from our end. We have Eric on the line. Hopefully, he's able to join and speak to the regulatory background. He works on the policy side here at Greenlights. Myself, Hong Love, work here on the product side. I'll be outlining kind of the pricing overview objectives in relation to OCPP. Then have Mo, a validation engineer here at Greenlights, and Frank, who will be talking about the actual OCPP implementation. So I'm just going to try one more time. Eric, are you there? No, okay. So not 100% familiar with these slides, but I'll do my best to kind of walk through them. Just because Eric is having some technical difficulties there. So to give it a little bit of background, the California DMS, or Department of Measurement Standard requirements, are adopted in relation to public charges, and it is a requirement starting. It was developed on January 1st, 2020, but the actual requirement implementation is required on January 1st, 2021 for level 2s. And these regulations have been modified or adopted based on the NIST standards, or National Institute standards, in particular the Handbook 44 documentation. And so these have been modified or adopted from those requirements for the specific state of California. So California is one of the first to kind of move forward on this, and so this is a new requirement that I guess all of us are kind of trying to handle at this present time. And it is a requirement in order to sell in California. You will need to be able to comply with this particular standard. So yeah, like I said, there's a couple of dates in relation to the particular DMS standard. The DC fast charge is a little bit further down the track of requiring this change. That's a January 1st, 2023. The one that we are all kind of working towards with here at Greenlights, and also along with our hardware partners, is for this 2021 kind of deadline, and that is related to level 2 AC installations. So if there's any charges that are installed prior to this date, then those do not have to comply for another 10 years. So that gives a little bit of breathing space for already installed units. And there are some kind of exceptions to these DMS requirements. Those who are owned and operated by public utilities, municipalities, those that are not in the public charging domain. So places like residential charging, workplace charging, and applications of that type of nature. And EVSEs that deliver wholesale electricities. So beyond the actual requirements that we'll be talking about later, in particular with OCPP, as it pertains to the communication between the backend and the EVSE unit, there are additional requirements that should be considered. They're mostly related to the actual EVSE hardware itself, and in particular to do with the actual metering and display of the actual measurement. So this includes things like the actual display and resolutions, the type of units. There's also requirements surrounding resetting of any type of being able to reset to any type of 0 for have the ability to do that. Scenarios surrounding the operation and event of power loss. specific testing capabilities. So there are outlines on how these things need to be tested out in the field. Probably one of the most important thing is the actual meter accuracy itself. And the DMS requirements specify this across a range of temperatures and a specific accuracy that the chargers need to comply with. Data loss and storage components. There's also things surrounding the actual physical labeling of the units, protection and tampering, and certain things like that as well that are specific to the charger, which should be considered, but aren't going to be discussed in today's talk. So what are we actually trying to achieve here in terms of the communication between the charger and the backend system? So there's several type of main objectives that we're trying to achieve here with regards to the OCPP communication. One is the display of the price to the users. So whether it is a default price or a specific user price. One is being able to provide these pricing updates during the session, and then providing a receipt and or display at the end of the session as well for what was actually charged to the driver. So I'll go into those a little bit more detail now. So there is a default pricing that is something that we will need to provide to the charger and be able to display on that charger for a user. And this pricing is what we kind of consider as like a walk-up pricing for the public. So this pricing could be a different price from a member price. For example, a member might be part of some kind of subscription that gets special pricing. So this type of default pricing is to allow, for example, a person off the side of the street, perhaps with a credit card, to be able to charge with a credit card swipe, for example. What would they be charged if they walk up off the street? The second component is user-specific pricing. So user-specific pricing needs to be clearly displayed before the start of the transaction. And this pricing may differ from the default pricing. So, for example, this pricing could be a subscription pricing that is, hey, Paul, can you go on mute, please? Thank you. This may be a specific pricing to that particular user that gives them a special pricing or special rate. So it can differ from what the default pricing is. We also need to be able to provide the option for the user to either select or opt out of that pricing, or basically to acknowledge that they accept those pricings and give them the opportunity perhaps to cancel their charge. So this can be achieved either by physical signage or some kind of display there, whether it be something that specifies something like by starting this transaction, you accept the pricing that's displayed on the screen, which can change between hours in the case of TOU pricing, or it could be a physical button that someone has to press to start the charge after they see the specific pricing to proceed to the next step. There needs to be a way for that user to either accept or opt out of those charges. And the other thing to note is the price displayed is the price that will be used for calculations. And what I mean by that is if you're showing that it's, for example, $1 per kilowatt hour, then all the calculations need to be based on that particular pricing. The pricing, it cannot differ from that. That is something the DMS regulations or testing requirements will check, that it is being priced as per what was displayed. DMS pricing is also kilowatt hour based pricing, so it is based on energy, though parking and idle fees can also be included in that pricing charge. So what type of pricing do we need to show during the actual usage? So we need to obviously be showing what is the current price for that particular period. So if it's a flat price, that's pretty straightforward. If it's $1 per kilowatt hour, we'll be showing $1 per kilowatt hour is the price per unit on the screen. For TOU pricing, then this needs to be updated or shown to reflect what the actual price is during that period of charge. And this is so that we can show that the running cost is calculated correctly. The running total to be shown as well needs to be updated on the screen during the session. And these include 3 elements: time, energy, and cost. At the end of the session, we will also need to be able to provide a breakdown of that session. Now, the receipt requirements for DMS are quite extensive. There are requirements there to provide a breakdown of every single pricing slot. So, for example, if it's a TOU-based pricing and a session happens to go over multiple time slots, then then each of those particular time slot charges will then be shown as a breakdown. So if it changes the price from $1 per kilowatt hour from 1 hour to $2 a kilowatt hour to the next hour, then those need to be broken out on the receipt. There's also much more in-depth requirements, but the main things we need to show, like transaction ID, the total time, total energy cost, total costs, any type of discount and taxes and things like that as well. So what we're thinking is we could, based on our engagements of some of the experts, is we could potentially provide a simplified version of this receipt in order for it to be shown on the screen, with the caveat of having to have a reference or ability for that user to obtain a full receipt, and in particular a printed copy of the receipt. So what I mean by that is we could potentially provide a transaction ID and a contact number, for example. So you could say, this is your transaction ID, 12345, call 1-800-CHARGE for more details or for a more detailed receipt, or review the app, or something of that nature. One of the explicit requirements of DMS is that the driver must be able to obtain a printed copy of the receipt by some means. So this could be either via a physical printer or via another method, such as the one I mentioned, to phone a number in order to obtain and talk to a representative to get a printed receipt. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Mo now, who will actually talk about the OCPP message sequence. Mo?
Oh, thank you, Hang, and thank you for filling in. It was a bit difficult, but you did great. Thank you. I'm going to mute you. I'm going to make Mo presenter now. One moment.
Thanks for that, Hang. So, yeah, as Hang mentioned, I'm just going to be getting into some of the nitty-gritty of how actually this will be done in OCPP, and I'll be going through how this is done in OCP 2.0.1 as well as in 1.6. So starting off with OCP 2.0.1, one thing that you would notice if you're familiar with the spec is that if you've implemented 2.0.1, you can actually meet the requirements that Hang has spoken about with the native messages. There's not really anything custom or special to do, but I will go through here like a standard charging flow and what that would look like. So upon boot or first time communication with the station, we will set that default price that Hang referred to using the set display message request. And this is a string, like 500 character string, and that is so that if some of those more complex pricing structures that Hang mentioned are present, like for different hours, that we can just have that all be in human readable format here. After that, it's the responsibility of the charging station to accept and then to display this default message when it's not when there's no charging session active. So this will just be sent whenever the pricing changes. So once that is displayed, the next thing that would happen in a normal flow is that the the user, the driver, will pull up to the EV and they'll present their identification, whether it's an RFID card or whatever it is. At that point, the station will send to the central server that user's ID token, and the central server can then refer to the internal pricing and then send down. We make use within the authorized response of OCPP2. There's a personal message field that we make use of to respond with what the pricing is for that particular customer. So once that happens, the user would plug in their vehicle, meaning that they accepted. This string could say something like, as Hong mentioned, that if you plug in and start the session, you accept the fees. So once that happens, we'll get the start transaction event request like normal, and then we'll enter this loop during the session. And during the session, this loop, what you'll see is that each time that we receive a meter value from the station, in the transaction event response, we will respond with the particular pricing during that session, which is a string. And we'll also use the standard cost updated request in OCPP, which is the decimal value, the running cost for the session, and then that specific transaction ID, which is important if there's a charge that has multiple handles, so you know which transaction that's applying to specifically. So this loop will continue through the duration of the session. And this is actually just the same loop here. Once the user stops, in this example, the user stops the session but does not unplug. Right? So whether they're presenting their RFID or remote stop, or whatever the case may be, we will get the transaction event that the charge session has stopped, and we can again respond here with the personal message field. And now we can include, this can say again whatever we want, but in this particular case, now we'll inform the user of the idle fee associated at that station. If the user stays and the station has an idle fee, then we enter this new loop where we'll be sending the running cost for the idle fee during that time, until which point we get the transaction event request letting us know that the user has unplugged their vehicle. So once that happens, then we'll send in the response personal message field, we'll send the total cost. So this would include all the idle fees, energy costs, any additional parking fees, any receipt information like phone numbers where you can get additional information if you wanted to have the printed receipt. But yeah, the main theme is that it's always a string from the central server, so that the charge point, the only responsibility is to display the string that we sent. So that's how we envision this being implemented for OCP 2.0.1. Now, as Hong mentioned earlier, especially for the level 2 units, the requirement for this is to be ready for 2021, which is it's less than 6 months away at this point. So realistically, to have a chance of people implementing this, I think there did have to be some way to do this in 1.6. So I'm sure, as most of you are aware, 1.6 is a bit older spec at this point, so it didn't have all of the native fields that were available in OCPP2. So the way that we've addressed this is through a combination of change configurations and data transfer requests. So I'll step through what the messaging between the charge point and central system look like for this case, and this is the same scenario as before, just for OCPP 1.6. So in this case here, the way it works for the default pricing, it's via change configuration request, and we have defined this key default price, and the value is same thing, 500 character string that we could specify the tariff for that time however we wanted. And then the charge point, again, it's the responsibility of the charge point to display this, and to display this anytime that it's idle, or that the charge point is not in an active session. So once the charge point is sitting there displaying its default price and a driver pulls up, the driver, just as before, would present their RFID or their identifying card, and the charger will send that to the central server. So the big difference here is in OCPP 1.6, there is no personal message field or anything in the authorized response. So we have to send this data transfer request, which we call set user price, and it has the ID token specific to the user, so the charge point can match it back, if it's on a specific handle. And then again, the string here that we can send whatever we like, and the charge point should accept that and then display the pricing for that specific user. Once that happens, the user can plug in and we get the start transaction like normal, and then we enter the loop during charging. So the difference here, again, is that we're using a data transfer request every time we receive a meter value. So each time the station tells us, okay, there's been more energy delivered, then we'll send down this data transfer request. It's pretty similar to the one before. The main difference is it's called running cost, and now we're including the specific transaction ID. But in this string here, we can include both the pricing and the running cost for that particular session. And this will, again, loop, and it will refresh as frequently as the meter values are received. So this is the same loop here. Once the driver reaches the end of the session and they, again, stop the session without unplugging the vehicle, so they've either presented their RFID card or sent a remote stop, then we get the stop transaction. And this is really the big difference between 1.6, or one of the big differences between 1.6 and 2.0 is the idle fee calculation is a little bit more complex because we as a central server need to know exactly when the user unplugged. All right, so by default, it may seem obvious or be tempting to use the status notifications to just wait until the charger goes back to available. But in fact, these status notifications are not part of the critical transactional messages. And if there's any communication issue or just for whatever reason the message doesn't get delivered, it's not required to be resent. So it's possible that that we wouldn't know how long that idle fee was, and it's really pretty critical because the requirements. I mean, if there's one thing the requirements are explicit about is that you have to do what you say you're going to do. So if we said the idle fee is $5 an hour, then we have to in fact charge that idle fee. So the way that this is addressed in 1.6, once we receive the stop transaction, we'll enter this idle fee loop where we'll show the running cost for the idle fee. But one new message that's been added here after the user unplugs is this data transfer request for connector unplugged. And this is to be considered a transactional message. And it's really pretty straightforward. It's just connector unplugged, and then the charge point gives the transaction ID, and then it gives the time at which the user was unplugged. And the purpose of this is that if there's, the charge point is offline momentarily, when it comes back, it will deliver the stop transaction and this connector unplugged notification so that the central server can then charge the appropriate idle fee. So after the user unplugs, the last data transfer that is defined here is this final cost data transfer, and it's pretty similar to the others, has a transaction ID, and then again in this string we can include all of the charges, including the idle fee, energy, parking fees, whatever other fees, and it's up to the station to display this. And notably, there's some things left out here that we expect that aren't in the scope of OCPP, like the meter accuracy and others, but even some that are in the scope of OCPP, that's this final cost. If you go through the requirements, it has to be displayed for a specific amount of time. I don't remember the number, maybe 30 seconds, something like that, or maybe 5 minutes even. But there's requirements that that the vendor will need to comply to that are not fully in the scope of this. And one thing that I also wanted to bring up that was in the first portion is the way that the certification works is that a solution of a charge point combined with a central server would be submitted for certification. And so this is really how we propose to address just the OCPP communication between the central server and the station. So that's it. That's the happy flow for the 1.6. And at this point, I will hand over to Frank.
Well, Mo has been very thorough in explaining the messages, so I will just more or less summarize the exact messages that are needed for 1.6. Because as he explained, in 2.01 there is support for these pricing requirements, but not in 1.6. So we can solve it with a number of data transfer requests that provide the necessary information. So as Mo showed, the default price and the walk-up price on display can simply be implemented by a custom configuration key, the default price, with a certain string that has to be displayed on the message. Then the user-specific price that has to be related to the user's ID token. It has to be sent by the central system. So you cannot do it with a change configuration in that case. So we propose a data transfer request for that links the ID token to the price string, as you see here at the bottom of the screen. Then during the session, you would have to display your cost, and we make a difference between the running cost and the final cost. It's basically the same message, but you want to let the charging station know when it's a final cost, because it might be displayed in a different manner on the charging station. So the cost is displayed as data transfer again, and we relate it to the transaction ID, because there may be multiple sessions running on the charging station. So you have to say, okay, the cost for this session is so much. And the same goes for the final cost. It's all formatted as a string, and then it's up to the charging station to display that string properly. So all calculations are done by the central server. Then there was the idle fee calculation. Well, Mo already explained that. The status notification is not queued, so it's not really reliable when the station goes offline for a short period. So we introduce a new message for that, a data transfer that we've called connector unplugged. And that will give you a timestamp exactly when the connector was unplugged. That can then be used for the idle fee calculation. So this is all you need to do for the 1.6, so it has some customization. But if you go to 2.1, I will show that it's really simple, because that already has all these messages included. And the display message, authorized response, etc. I will quickly show them. So to show the default price on the display, we have to set display message request that you can use to show that. And the user specific price is automatically returned in the authorized response. So you don't need to do anything special for that. The display cost can be displayed, for example, upon every received meter value by the cost updated request, with the price related to a transaction. And in the transaction event response, even during the session, you can also show a new personal message, for example, if the price has changed for that hour. And then the final cost again can be displayed at the end of the transaction in the transaction event response. And then finally, the idle fee calculation in OCPP 201 is really simple, because 201 has a configurable start and stop point for a transaction. So if you configure the transaction stop point as EV connected, then the charging station will keep the transaction open as long as the EV remains connected. So you don't need to take any special measurements to calculate the idle fee. So to wrap it up, in OCPP 2.1, it already have the support for all the California DMS requirements. And in OCPP 1.6, we need a few custom data transfer messages to support it, but they are fairly simple to implement. You just need the mutual agreement between the parties. And in order to facilitate that, we as an Open Charge Alliance, together with input from Greenlots, have created an application note that exactly describes this process. So this was my contribution. I suggest we go to the questions.
In case an app is used to stop the transaction and there is an idle fee, is it mandatory to inform the end user via the app?
Yeah, I could take that one. Yes, we are planning on having all the same things that would be displayed on the charger displayed in the app. That one is a bit easier because it's all controlled by the central server, so we just send it to our own app.
Okay. And let's see, is a receipt only for direct payment, credit card, etc. required, or also when a charge card from an EMPS is used?
So our understanding is it's required for any transaction. So a receipt needs to be provided, and the option of a printed receipt also needs to be provided, regardless of how the transaction was actually initiated.
Okay. And would it be sufficient when an app would display the breakdown of the transaction, or does it need to be a physical version of, or would a digital version be okay?
Yeah, so if you're talking about the receipt, the way we're looking at implementing it is we are looking at having it as a electronic version. But per DMS requirements, it does specifically call out that it needs the option or have the ability to provide the driver an option for a physical printed copy. So the way we're looking at implementing it is via providing a phone number or a way for them to contact our call center. And then our call center will be able to handle that through a process should someone actually want to have a physical copy.
Okay. Are you planning to push your vendors to go to 2.0.1 to support pricing?
On our end, we're mindful of the fact that this is quite a short kind of fuse that we need to kind of work with at this present time. So the way Greenlots is implemented and working with our hardware partners is we're looking at implementing the modified 1.6 version for the immediate action, with the intention to slowly work up to 2.0. I don't think anyone is right now in the position to, implement 2.0 right now to meet that particular timeline. So we are working with the 1.6 modified at this present time.
Okay, now for a question, how simple is the upgrade from 1.6 to 2.0.1?
Not very simple, I don't think. I think it's quite a bit of work for whoever is doing it. I think the documentation is very good and the capabilities are very good, but it definitely requires some work.
As it also depends on how much you want to implement. I mean, you can implement 201 with a fixed transaction model that exactly mirrors what you have in 1.6, and then start with that, and then later on extend to the other possibilities. But then at least you will have the display message and the cost updated and things like that. So
okay,
there are ways.
Okay, I have two questions about printed receipts. Let's see. First of all, thanks to Hang for the call center solution. And the question is, hard receipt printer inside or attached to the charging station? And someone asked, is there any standard format for the printed receipts?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is you could potentially provide a printed receipt option that is a physical printer on the charger itself. I don't believe that this is something that has come up as an option that any of our hardware vendors would like to pursue at this present time. So it's not something that we've actually put a lot of consideration into, the actual getting a physical receipt. Obviously, that's a much more that's an additional cost, and then physical maintenance and things like that as well. So to be honest, I'm not 100% sure on what those specific, if there are any specific requirements or standards that the receipt printer needs to meet if you are looking for using that option. But yeah, to be fair, we haven't particularly looked into that path. We are looking at the path of providing a phone number, and you know, having that method as a way of getting a physical receipt. We're just mindful of the fact that most of our users will be, you know, already using the mobile app and bits and pieces as well. So they would most likely be opting out of a physical receipt itself. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah,
If I can add
besides
to that,
the phone number, you could also show a URL, for example, a link to a site where user can enter a transaction ID and then they get a PDF of the receipt.
Exactly, Frank. So this
yeah,
is
and then if
definitely
I can just add the format for that receipt, not the printed one, but the one that we'd be showing on the website or wherever. Yeah, my understanding is there is not a standard format, but the requirement is that you just have to show everything that you've done. So if you're charging extra during this period of time, or this idle fee or that parking fee, you just have to have that as a line item.
Correct. There are some additional parameters as well that I would suggest you read as part of your own investigations. There are some additional components that need to be shown as well on the actual receipt, such as like the total time, start time, transaction ID, location, name. There's a few other bits and pieces as well that needs to be shown.
Okay, let's see, we are running out of time, but we can squeeze in a couple more questions. Let's see, California DMS requires a physical display for metering certification verification. So pricing display cannot be remote, app or web. Is that correct?
Yeah, so from our understanding and from what we've been talking to, who we've been talking to give us some advice, is that the actual system that will be kind of approved, that display is not the app display, it's the display that's going to be on the actual unit. So that is why we are kind of going down this whole path to providing all this information across to the charger, not only for the case of anonymous charging, but just to meet the requirements that actual display is actually part of that the actual EVSE unit itself, as opposed to the app.
Yeah, how about a unit without a display on it? Does it have any chance of getting certified? I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, we don't believe that a charger without a display will be able to meet the DMS standards.
Unless there's a separate kiosk for a backup charger. Yep.
That's a good point, Eric.